Your next car is already more expensive, and no one told you why. It wasn't a factory issue. It wasn't a chip shortage. It was a sentence, just one. Spoken from the Oval Office, it ricocheted across oceans and detonated inside boardrooms. No exemptions, no warnings, just a 25% shock to the system. Within days, Ford slammed the brakes on exports. Buick's best-selling models became showroom liabilities. In Tokyo, trade officials scrambled to stabilize the yen and quietly offered rice shipments in exchange for tariff relief. In Brussels, retaliation was drafted line by line. And while Washington doubled down, the rest of the world started walking away. You won't see this unraveling on a dealership sticker, but it's there. In every delay, every price jump, every shrinking incentive. Stay locked in, because we're pulling back the curtain on the auto war no one's prepared for. By the end, you'll know exactly who's losing, who's cashing in, and why the scariest part is what happens next. China's Counterpunch unleashed. Just 48 hours after the United States imposed its sweeping auto tariffs, China struck back. No hesitation, no warning. A single retaliatory move sent shockwaves through the American auto industry. Tariffs as high as 125% on vehicles built in the United States. The message from the world's second-largest economy was unmistakable. And the effects were immediate, unforgiving, and deeply strategic. China wasn't just another export destination for American automakers. It was the export destination. For brands like Ford and General Motors, China had become the key to offsetting stagnation in domestic markets. Full-size pickups, premium sport utility vehicles, and high-performance sedans had found loyal buyers in cities like Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Chengdu. These weren't novelty items, they were status symbols, rolling testaments to American engineering. That loyalty dissolved overnight. A base model pickup that sold for $40,000 in the United States would now cost over $100,000 in mainland China, not because of a new feature or a shortage in supply, but because of geopolitics. Overnight, American cars were transformed into financial liabilities, uninsurable, unfinanceable, and economically radioactive. Chinese buyers, once willing to wait months for American-built trucks and SUVs, disappeared. Distributors hit the brakes. Dealers in Beijing took down promotional signage. A Ford distributor in Shanghai canceled 2 weeks of scheduled shipments within hours. "No one will pay those prices," he said, "not even the collectors." It wasn't just a sales problem. It was a reputational meltdown. After years spent building credibility and trust with Chinese consumers, American automakers found themselves boxed out of the market by decree. Loyalty couldn't survive a 100% markup. Ford didn't issue a press release. They didn't announce a strategic pivot. Their reply came in silence, followed by a full stop. Ford's export freeze. Inside Ford's Dearborn headquarters, the decision was swift and absolute. All exports to China were suspended. No exceptions. The F-150 Raptor, the Mustang, and every top-selling sport utility vehicle, all grounded. There was nothing to debate. With prices doubling from tariffs, the Chinese market had vanished. Ford's logistics teams rerouted shipments to domestic storage. Port facilities in Michigan and Illinois went silent. Internally, the term was parked, not delayed. Parked. No public statement was made, but word spread fast. Dealers in Ohio and California described it as an inventory shock. Floor plans froze. Orders were canceled. No one had answers. At the plants, the signs were clear. Trailers stopped arriving. Shifts were shortened, and production lines slowed. Workers had seen this before, only this time it felt worse. This wasn't a temporary glitch. It was a system cracking under pressure. Ford had taken a direct hit, and next in line was Buick. Buick's momentum shattered. Buick had spent years rebuilding its identity, quietly, methodically. It had launched a new generation of small sport utility vehicles, like the Encore GX, the Envista, and the Envision. Finally, something clicked. In the most recent quarter, sales jumped by nearly 40% nationwide. The momentum was real, but then came the tariffs, and with them the collapse. Every one of Buick's new models was built overseas. The Encore GX and the Envista were assembled in South Korea. The Envision was produced in China. Under the new rules, those vehicles were about to become luxury-priced overnight. South Korean-built models now face tariffs of 27.5%. The China-built Envision, nearly 50% in combined tariffs and handling fees. That meant a $30,000 vehicle could now push past $45,000 once it landed in the United States. Dealers who had just finished building buzz around Buick's reinvention suddenly found themselves facing sticker shock. One manager at a Los Angeles dealership said, "We finally got young buyers in the door. Now they're walking right back out." Buick's corporate team tried to stay optimistic. Incentives were floated. Alternative sourcing was discussed, but one national analyst offered a more sobering prediction. If these tariffs stick, Buick's recovery is finished. It may not survive the next pricing cycle. Across the Pacific, while American automakers were stumbling, another government was drawing up a new strategy, one that would trade crops for cars. If this is what one sentence can do to the global auto market, imagine what tomorrow's policy could unleash. We're tracking every twist before it hits your wallet, so if you want to stay ahead, not just informed, subscribe now. The next shockwave is already loading. Japan's diplomatic food for tariff offer. In Tokyo, the reaction was not fiery, but strategic. Japan knew it could not match tariff for tariff, not without hurting its own economy. Instead, it offered something unexpected: rice and soybeans. In a quiet proposal delivered through diplomatic channels, Japan suggested increasing its imports of American agricultural products in exchange for relief from the auto tariffs that now threatened its largest industry. This was not just about trade, it was survival politics disguised as commerce. Japan's economy leaned heavily on auto exports to the United States, with millions of vehicles shipped each year by companies like Toyota, Honda, and Subaru. Every single one of those now faced a 25% tariff at the American border. The stakes were immense. Japan's proposal, detailed in a government briefing leaked by reporters, outlined a path to buy billions of dollars in soybeans, corn, and rice to offset the trade imbalance. Officials hoped this food for cars exchange would appease the White House without triggering further escalation. An Iowa farmer who had been watching soybean prices fall said simply, "If Japan steps up, we can breathe again." In the Oval Office, President Donald Trump met with Japan's lead negotiator, and according to aides, progress was made. Back in Europe, however, patience was running out. European Union's coming Counterstrike. In Brussels, the language was colder. The European Union was not negotiating. It was retaliating. Trade ministers were preparing a new round of countermeasures designed to mirror the American tariffs in precision and pain. European manufacturers were already running simulations of what would happen if exports to the United States collapsed. The European Union was a different kind of opponent, less emotional, more legalistic. Under World Trade Organization rules, they had every right to respond. What was coming next was not a shouting match. It was a scalpel. Reports from Berlin suggested that BMW and Volkswagen were quietly shifting distribution from United States-bound shipments to new markets in Southeast Asia. A senior logistics officer put it plainly, "We'll redirect the cars. The Americans can pay more." Tariffs on steel, aluminum, and vehicles were all on the table. And although the European Union had not yet revealed the full list, internal documents confirmed that some American products would be targeted symbolically: motorcycles, whiskey, and even blue jeans. While the European Union mapped its counterstrike, South Korea was turning inward. South Korea's factory reevaluation. In Seoul, the conversation was different. South Korean automakers had made massive investments in American factories over the past several years, building a local footprint to avoid exactly this kind of tariff chaos. Now those plans were being re-evaluated. Internal board memos from one of South Korea's largest automakers outlined a contingency plan to shift new model production to Vietnam and Mexico, where trade agreements could soften the blow. The United States, once considered a safe bet, now carried a risk premium. One union leader in Ulsan said his members were worried. "We were building jobs in America. Now we are wondering if that effort was wasted." The South Korean government, still officially aligned with Washington on security matters, found itself in a difficult position. Publicly, they urged calm. Privately, executives from Hyundai and Kia expressed doubts that the American market would remain reliable. The result was strategic retreat. Not abandonment, not yet, but a recalibration of what the American market was worth. And while automakers began redrawing their investment maps, a deeper threat was quietly growing: supply chain weaponization. In the world of manufacturing, not every crisis begins with a headline. Some start with a wire, a sensor, a box of semiconductors rerouted through customs. Beneath the tariffs on finished vehicles, a more complex battle was unfolding, one that targeted the parts and components that made those vehicles possible. From wiring harnesses sourced in Mexico to lithium batteries from China and spark plugs built in Japan, the modern automobile is a global puzzle. Now, every piece of that puzzle came with a surcharge. A 15% 15% tariff on a component might seem manageable until you multiplied it across the thousands of pieces required to build even a base model. A chief financial officer from one Detroit automaker put it simply: a $1 part now costs $1.15. That sounds small, until you realize we buy millions of them. On showroom floors, those cents became dollars. On dealer lots, those dollars became lost sales. Inside factories, those lost sales became canceled shifts. One engineer described the dilemma as trying to assemble a house of cards during an earthquake. Every move costs more, takes longer, or might not happen at all. None of this had made it into the public conversation yet. There were no breaking headlines, no viral moments, just rising costs, falling margins, and quiet recalculations happening in boardrooms from Seoul to Stuttgart to Silicon Valley. Inside Ford, those recalculations were already taking shape in black and white slides, buried inside an internal presentation marked Q2 Contingency. Internal warning signals. Inside Ford's financial planning division, quiet alarm bells were going off. A presentation labeled Q2 Contingency had begun circulating among senior staff. The language was clinical, but the implications were anything but. If the tariffs remained in place through the next fiscal quarter, Ford would have no choice but to increase the prices of multiple high-volume models. The math was simple. The consequences were not. Margins were already tight. A projected increase of $1,500 to $3,000 per unit might not seem devastating at first glance, yet spread across thousands of vehicles, it became catastrophic. The market would not absorb the added cost. Ford knew it. Dealers knew it. The only question was who would say it out loud. Inside one thread of internal emails, a product manager posed a question to the finance team. Are we modeling buyer dropout rates beyond a $3,000 price jump? The reply was short: not yet, but we should. Executives were caught in a bind. Going public meant panic. Saying nothing meant drifting toward a cliff with no brakes. Behind the scenes, financial officers debated incentives, rebates, and regional markups. In public, the messaging stayed positive. On the surface, nothing had changed. But deep inside the company's forecasting models, the storm had already arrived. And while boardrooms braced for impact, the people on showroom floors were already feeling it. Consumers under financial assault. For car buyers, the warning signs did not come in memos. They came in price tags. A new vehicle that had cost $33,000 just a few months earlier now hovered closer to $37,000. 0% financing offers were quietly replaced with 2.9% rates. Cashback promotions were trimmed, lease terms tightened. For many Americans, the dream of upgrading to a new vehicle slipped just out of reach. Loan rejections began to rise. Monthly payments swelled past thresholds buyers had once considered non-negotiable. The shift wasn't dramatic, but it was constant, and it was everywhere. One family in Phoenix had spent weeks test driving mid-sized sport utility vehicles. When they returned to sign the paperwork, the numbers had changed. "We were quoted $368 per month," the father said. "Then it became $425. That's not a small difference to us." Dealers struggled to adjust. Salespeople walked a delicate line, trying to explain tariff-induced pricing without sending buyers running. Some used euphemisms: supplier strain, cost realignment, market recalibration. Others simply said nothing, hoping a strong pitch would overcome sticker shock. Meanwhile, banks grew cautious. Credit unions began requiring larger down payments. Loan approvals slowed. Every layer of the car buying process now carried an extra degree of friction. Yet, even as consumers struggled to adapt, automakers faced an even more fragile future, one built on batteries, rare minerals, and global dependencies that were rapidly turning against them. Electric vehicles at risk. The push toward electric vehicles had once been seen as the solution to the automotive industry's future. Clean energy, long-term savings, reduced maintenance, all of it promising a new chapter of innovation and sustainability. But the electric dream was colliding head-on with the geopolitics of minerals. Electric vehicles rely heavily on lithium-ion battery systems. Those batteries are made using highly refined elements like cobalt, nickel, and lithium, minerals dominated by extraction and processing operations in China. While American automakers had made strides in developing new battery technologies and forming partnerships with local suppliers, the raw reality remained unchanged. The vast majority of their supply chain still flowed through Beijing's gate. Now, Chinese officials were hinting at new restrictions. Quietly, state-run news outlets published op-eds questioning whether the country should continue exporting battery-grade lithium to nations imposing tariffs on its vehicles. Policy drafts were leaked, suggesting a quota system for rare earth exports. The implications were enormous. Without those minerals, battery assembly lines in Nevada, Michigan, and Texas would grind to a halt. Production targets would collapse. Launch timelines would be postponed. A senior engineer at a Silicon Valley electric vehicle startup described the situation bluntly. If China turns off the tap, the whole sector goes dry. There's no immediate workaround. Government agencies scrambled to assess the risk. Could American mines increase output fast enough? Could Australia or Chile step in? Could recycling provide enough secondary supply? The answers were sobering. Not soon, not fast, not enough. And in the middle of it all were consumers once excited by the promise of electric mobility, now wondering if their next vehicle would be delayed, overpriced, or canceled altogether. While the electric transition faltered, a more traditional danger loomed, one tied to factories, shifts, and the jobs that still powered towns across the country. Global production restructuring. Across the manufacturing belt of the United States, a wave of uncertainty spread from boardrooms to shop floors. Assembly lines that had once operated on precision scheduling now faced gaps in parts, fluctuations in orders, and sudden shifts in supply. The question hanging in the air was no longer if adjustments would come, but when. Companies began modeling scenarios they had hoped to avoid. If tariffs continued through the next fiscal quarter, suppliers would begin scaling back. If shipping delays continued to stretch beyond acceptable margins, investment would be pulled. If parts from Asia faced further levies, American plants would slow or close. Internal reports from one supplier predicted that a continuation of current trade tensions would result in the elimination of 15% of their workforce by the end of the fiscal year. That translated to hundreds of jobs in Ohio, Indiana, and Pennsylvania. In private meetings, executives discussed whether consolidation was more viable than maintaining multiple underused facilities. In one Michigan town, rumors swirled around the local assembly plant. Some workers were told not to expect weekend shifts. Others reported tools being packed for shipment to a different facility. One longtime employee said, "We've been through slowdowns before. This feels different." The economic cost was not limited to lost wages. Restaurants near factories saw fewer lunchtime orders. Small businesses depending on plant traffic saw receipts drop. A quiet contraction was underway. And across it all, there was a growing recognition that the damage might not be temporary. If foreign automakers began pulling out entirely, redirecting investment, consolidating operations, shifting focus to other markets, those job losses could become permanent. As the American manufacturing base braced for deeper disruption, a more urgent conversation began in Washington. The industry had absorbed the first shocks. Now policymakers faced a choice that would shape the next chapter. Washington's high-stakes choices. Inside the walls of the United States Capitol, pressure was mounting. The trade war had entered a phase that could no longer be managed with slogans or press conferences. Every agency involved, from the Office of the United States Trade Representative to the Department of Commerce, was now scrambling to propose options. The future of the American auto industry no longer hinged on engineering or innovation. It hinged on policy, and that policy was being shaped in real time. There were four distinct paths under consideration. The first involved striking a bilateral deal with Japan. More agricultural purchases in exchange for scaled-back tariffs on vehicle exports. The second was to exempt South Korean and Chinese automakers from specific duties through national security waivers. A third option considered forming a broader alliance with the European Union to create a shared automotive framework that would stabilize pricing, parts movement, and long-term investment across borders. The fourth path was the most dangerous and perhaps the most likely. Double down. Hold the line on tariffs and force trading partners to absorb the consequences. Political advisors were split. Some believed any sign of compromise would be framed as weakness. Others warned that continuing down this road would result in mass layoffs, investor flight, and a consumer revolt. In the end, the choice belonged to the administration. A White House aide described the mood as defiant but nervous. The clock was ticking. Quarterly earnings would soon reveal the first visible cracks. A decision would need to be made. Meanwhile, auto executives were no longer waiting for permission to act. Industry's counter strategies. Inside the headquarters of several major manufacturers, contingency plans had moved from whiteboards to execution. While political leaders debated tariffs and trade alliances, corporate planners were redeploying capital. One automaker had already signed a joint venture agreement with a Vietnamese assembly plant that would double production capacity by 2026. Another had approved new sourcing contracts for battery enclosures from suppliers in India. What once took years to plan was now happening in weeks. Speed had become a survival strategy. Executives understood the risk. Moving operations outside the United States invited criticism. It also carried logistical complications. Transport costs would rise. Quality control would need revalidation. Domestic political backlash could threaten subsidies or incentives. Still, the numbers told a clear story. A vehicle assembled outside the tariff zone, even with increased shipping expenses, would cost less than one built domestically with taxed parts. A senior strategist at a leading automaker summed it up. Every spreadsheet we run points in the same direction. If tariffs stay, we have to move. These decisions were not theoretical. Materials were being ordered, construction permits were being filed. By the time Washington decided its next step, factories would already be rising in other parts of the world. Across the United States, buyers began to sense that the industry they once trusted was quietly shifting beneath them. The Consumers Crossroads. The car lot felt different. Buyers were asking new questions. Why is the price higher than last month? Why is there no rebate this time? When will the new model arrive? For most consumers, the trade war was never about headlines. It was about affordability, reliability, the feeling of being able to walk into a dealership and drive away with a fair deal. That confidence was slipping. New vehicle sales began to dip. Used vehicle prices started to climb. Ride-sharing subscriptions saw an uptick in urban areas. More people delayed purchases, opting to keep older vehicles on the road longer. In rural areas, some families turned to auctions or direct-from-owner purchases to avoid dealer markups. An independent lot owner in Tennessee said, "We used to move entry-level sedans like clockwork. Now people come in, ask about financing, and walk right back out." Surveys showed a clear pattern. Consumers were not angry, but they were adapting. The American car-buying public was resilient, but not immune. If prices kept rising, alternatives would flourish. Car-sharing services, subscription-based leases, even electric bicycles and compact urban scooters were gaining ground. The question looming over the entire market was no longer what's available. It was, what are people willing to pay? From boardrooms to showrooms, the system was recalibrating. Still, one question lingered. What kind of system would emerge from this transformation? The future of globalized auto. What came next would not be a return to the past. Globalization, once seen as inevitable, had entered a new chapter. The world's automotive giants were no longer building strategies around free trade or open markets. They were preparing for resilience, redundancy, regionalization. Supply chains were being redesigned to avoid single points of failure. That meant more microfactories, fewer mega facilities, fewer transcontinental shipping routes, more regional supplier clusters. Executives were studying trade policy with the same urgency once reserved for emissions testing or crash safety. Some speculated about a future where regional trade blocs, such as the United States, Mexico, and Canada, would form tight production alliances, ensuring that most of a vehicle's parts came from within one economic zone. Others saw the rise of national champions, state-backed automakers, dominating their local markets and fending off foreign competitors with regulatory shields. Investors began demanding geopolitical risk assessments alongside earnings projections. Labor unions shifted their strategy, pressing not only for wages and benefits, but for location guarantees and plant continuity. One veteran analyst said it best, "We're not just watching the auto industry adapt to tariffs. We're watching it reinvent itself for a world where trade is no longer safe." In the midst of that reinvention, the average driver, the commuter, the contractor, the caregiver would soon discover whether this new system served them better or left them behind. The next tweet, the next policy paper, the next unannounced levy, any of them could redraw the map of the global automotive economy. The trade war had begun with headlines. Now it was shaping hard decisions, personal sacrifices, and long-term consequences. And while no one could say exactly what the next chapter would bring, one thing had become clear. The cost of protectionism was no longer invisible. It was on the sticker, in the factory, at the border, on the line. Is this the rebirth of American industry or the collapse of global trade as we know it? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for watching and sticking with us to the end.